An article was recently published in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Are Therapists to Blame for the Rise of Adults Cutting Off Their Parents?" written by Elizabeth Bernstein. I wanted to respond to this article, point out some of the ways in which its claims were not supported by the research, and explain my own perspective as a former therapist, but also I'd like to treat this a little bit as an exercise in critical thinking to show the importance of checking the source, paying attention to its biases, and the way it's written with a specific narrative in mind. Let's dive in. So the article starts with an anecdote from a woman who claims a reputable therapist advised her to cut off her mom in the second session. And so she did it, resulting in a decade-long estrangement from her mom. And the journalist Elizabeth Bernstein asks, is it really good therapy to break your mother's heart? Later in the article, we learned that once the woman in question became a mother herself, she realized that all parents have flaws and she reconnected with her mom. Okay, so first of all, while it's horrible for a therapist to tell a client to cut off their family member, especially so early on, you have to remember that this is just one anecdote. This is not something that happens very frequently. In my 10 years of studying to become a therapist, I not once met a therapist who told a client to do something like this. Nor did I meet a therapist who was teaching other therapists in training to do that. In fact, we were very, very much encouraged to empower clients to make their own decisions, to not act like we were the experts on their life choices, to give clients tools, but ultimately leave it up to them to apply those tools to their own lives. That's not to say that this never happens. If this has happened to you, you deserve to talk about it, and I'm genuinely so sorry that it did. But you have to know that this is not the norm. This is unethical behavior. Because here's the other thing about this. There are unprofessional professionals in every single field. And if you happen to come across one, you should leave. You should be aware that that's what you're dealing with and you should not stick around. But please don't take that to mean that all professionals are like this. You know, if you're robbed by a South Asian person, doesn't mean that all South Asians are thieves. If you have a really bad experience with a dentist, doesn't mean all dentists are like that. And likewise, if you have an experience with a therapist who tells you to cut off your mom in the second session, that doesn't mean that all therapists do that. I'm not saying the person who had this experience does assume all therapists are like this, but it does kind of seem like that's the narrative the journalist seems to be pushing, given how one anecdote is being treated as evidence for the claim that therapists in general are encouraging people to cut off their family members. And I feel sad for this person because they gave so much weight to one person's opinion, enough to stay away from her mother for 10 years. And this goes to show therapists hold a great degree of power in the relationship. And it sounds like this therapist way abused that power. But this is why we need to assess people's arguments based on the merit of their arguments rather than based on their qualifications. Because sure, people with qualifications in a specific field might be more likely to know what they're talking about, but they can still be wrong. Having qualifications is not a logical argument. So I'm kind of curious what actual argument her therapist gave to suggest this on the second session. And also, 10 years of estrangement because of something a person said who she had just met. That's a long time to stay away from someone just because someone told you to. And so I kind of wonder about the dynamics there. You know, I wonder, is there a part of that person that already wanted to cut off her mom? And maybe her therapist advising her to do that sort of felt like a safer way to finally pull the trigger on that desire. The next paragraph I'm about to read you is where I really start to notice a bias showing up in the way the article is written. But first, I want to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Quince. This is a sweater I just got from them, by the way. Quince is an online shop for high-quality clothing, home goods, accessories, and more recently also a wellness line. So you guys already know I use their collagen peptides in my matcha latte every day. I've shown you how I make a high-protein chocolate pudding with their chocolate protein powder. But now I want to show you my latest obsession, their mushroom coffee. Quince's mushroom coffee only contains half the caffeine of a standard cup of coffee, and it also contains mushrooms. I personally adore mushrooms. I cook with them almost every single day. So I love the taste of mushrooms, but this coffee does not taste like mushrooms, okay? This coffee tastes like a combination between like like dark chocolate and chai tea. I could tell right away that it had cinnamon and cardamom. It really is like a spiced chai kind of taste. It helps me get an extra boost of energy and focus throughout the day, but without the jitters or crash of another full cup of coffee. And of course, you know the drill. When it comes to Quince, it's organic, it's third-party tested, it has no added sugar, no artificial flavors, no preservatives, none of that. This is what I love about Quince. So many of their products are just so natural and health-focused, but without breaking the bank. Quince also sells the type of sunscreen that I've been using for years. I literally have an entire stock of Supergoop SPF because it's the only sunscreen I've ever tried that doesn't make my skin look super white. I mean, just look how it melts into my skin. And this is SPF 50, by the way. They also sell clothes, jewelry, accessories, shoes, bed sheets, home decor, whatever you need, they got it. Like this fisherman sweater that I got from them, I cannot wait for it to be autumn so that I can curl up in this fisherman sweater with my cup of mushroom coffee, and summer is going to be gone and it's going to be great. Also, Quince offers free shipping and a 365 money-back guarantee. Check out Quince's new wellness line as well as everything else they have to offer using my link down below or click the QR code on screen. Thank you so much to Quince. Okay, I had to take the sweater off because I can't have the AC running while I record because it's really noisy. So going back to the article, here's where I really start to notice a bias in the way the article is written. Listen to this paragraph. Proponents of the trend hold that advising patients to consider a cutoff from a close relative or spouse they deem toxic or unsupportive can protect their mental health and allow for emotional growth. Meanwhile, critics, many of whom are researchers who have studied relationships for decades, say that it encourages self-centeredness and self-delusion and ruins families. First of all, it's not a trend. It's a very loaded term to use when we have absolutely no evidence that levels of family estrangement are higher now than they ever were in the past. But notice how proponents of the trend is very vague. There are no specific quotes or references, which kind of allows for easier straw manning of the argument, while critics are specified to be researchers who have studied relationships for decades. In reality, most professionals are neither proponents nor critics. They are professionals who empower people to make whatever choice is right for them for their specific circumstances. The non-credible ones are anyone telling people this is the right thing to do, whether they're pro or against estrangement. And then the journalist cites some of the main people who sort of flat out position themselves as being against estrangement, including Carl Pilmer, Peter Anderson. I was literally just waiting for Josh Coleman's name to show up. I did a review of Pilmer's book and an entire video on why I disagree with Peter Anderson, which just makes me think that like in this anti-estrangement sphere, there's a very loud minority that keeps fueling the fire of this discussion. Once you start to pay attention to the names and you're familiar with a lot of the sort of like big hitters in these conversations, you realize that it's the same people having these conversations over and over again. The journalist cites Peter Anderson, who says, therapists are taught to believe what the client is saying at face value. I'm not sure where he's getting this impression from. In my own clinical training, I was very much taught to pay attention to cognitive distortions like black and white thinking, to defense mechanisms like projection and splitting. We were taught about the ways in which certain disorders can distort perceptions of reality. We were taught how to do a reality test to make sure somebody isn't undergoing psychosis or doesn't have a diluted sense of reality. There were many times in my time as a therapist when I wondered whether a client was being fully honest with me or even themselves, and I brought that up in supervision and consultation to determine the best way to help them given my suspicion. There were times when I could tell that someone was being manipulative in their relationships even as they were framing themselves a victim to me. There were times when I had to call in a supervisor for risk reasons, and my supervisor very bluntly told me that they had doubts about my client's story. There were just tons of instances where the client was not simply blindly believed. But with that being said, it is not a therapist's job to ascertain the truth, to sort of like get to the bottom of whether they're lying to you. Even if a client does have a completely skewed perception of reality or is manipulating you, it's kind of important for the therapist to run with that to sort of help them. Like, let's say that someone says, the people in my life, they're always out to get me. Let's say that they have like sort of like paranoid persecutory beliefs, maybe due to severe narcissism, let's say. The therapist should lean into that rather than tell them, you're seeing things wrong, let me tell you how it really is. Like, that's not going to help anyone. Instead, they can say, wow, it sounds like you're feeling very unjustly treated by this person. And this has happened a lot of times for you. Tell me more about that. And then they can say, I wonder, has anyone made you feel this way before? What's the earliest memory you can remember of someone making you feel this way? And over time, they can sort of gently start to challenge the underlying distortions. Like saying, I noticed some parallels between this situation and the way you reacted when I needed to cancel last week's session. I was wondering if we could maybe talk about that. And eventually, hopefully, the client slowly starts to gain insight into the way they're misreading the situation and unfairly accusing people. Simply telling a client, you're not seeing things clearly here, I'll tell you the real truth, is not going to be helpful. Even if they're lying to you, to themselves, that's not the way to heal a person. The therapist doesn't need to know the real truth. They can help the client with nothing more than what is in the therapy room. So Bernstein then seems to blame social media for providing support to those navigating emotionally immature parents and estrangement situations. I've talked about this enough times before, I'm getting kind of tired of saying it. There is no evidence that estrangement rates are higher now than they were in the past. It's very likely that social media is giving a name to the phenomenon and helping people find support and community, but there's no evidence that it's actually fueling estrangement. Because in reality, people in happy, supportive relationships would never leave a relationship simply because they learned about estrangement on social media, right? Like if tomorrow there's a divorce trend online where suddenly divorce is really trendy, that's not going to motivate me to divorce my husband who I'm happy with. Like, it doesn't matter how trendy it is, how much I want to fit in with this group, it's just not going to happen. And if someone does do that, if someone does say, I want to cut off specifically a parent, like a loving parent, because I want to fit in with other people online, there's likely something that went wrong in their upbringing too. There's likely some opportunity to educate that person that was missed. Bernstein then references Whitney Goodman, who's an LMFT who does a lot of work around estrangement. I think she's actually working on a book right now. I'm really excited to read that once it comes out. But here's another place where I felt like Bernstein was not being balanced in the way she was framing this discussion. She referenced Whitney Goodman's more than 660,000 followers, which, if you read between the lines, kind of makes it sound like, wow, she's so influential, she must be influencing people to go no contact with their family members, especially considering it's right after Bernstein just insinuated that social media is fueling estrangement. You'll notice the journalist didn't do this. She didn't sort of like highlight the platform of any of the anti-estrangement people she mentioned. Like Carl Pilmer wrote an article with Mel Robbins for the New York Times, which was widely discussed by people. His book Fault Lines seemed to have sold quite well, and yet no mention is his platform. And here's the thing, Whitney Goodman is not even pro-estrangement. Her content is extremely balanced and professional. She provides support to people going through estrangement, but also she has resources for preventing estrangement, for rekindling after estrangement. But the journalist sort of almost positions her as pro-estrangement, and she then refutes Goodman's quotes by citing what nebulous critics say. Critics, however, say the therapist should be questioning their clients' estrangement beliefs, not affirming them. They warn that patients aren't always reliable narrators, especially if they have mental health issues, and the therapist is hearing only one side of the story. And then the article goes into something that can quite easily be disproven by the most recent research. Critics also argue that there is no scientific evidence that separating from a close relative is inherently beneficial, and the long-term damage, including broken relationships with siblings, grandchildren, and parents as they age, is often unanticipated. Indeed, research from Cornell's Pilmer and colleagues show that while people who start a cutoff often feel a temporary sense of relief, they also experience significantly higher rates of chronic unhappiness and depression over time. He calls this the exeter cost. Okay, here's the first piece of evidence that this is not true. I did an entire video breaking down the following article. This article found that negative family relationships were linked to poor mental health much more than positive family relationships were linked with good mental health. And this was a massive meta-analysis, by the way. It's not just like one small study. In other words, bad family relationships do a lot more harm than good family relationships do good, disproving the common notion that you just need to stay with people who hurt you because they love you and you need the support. By the time someone's considering a cutoff, it's pretty fair to say that they're feeling pretty hurt by the relationship, and so that negative family relationship relationship needs to be addressed. Now, the study doesn't suggest you need to cut them off or not, but it does provide evidence that staying in negative relationships without doing something about it, be it family therapy or setting boundaries or estranging yourself, is going to take a toll on you. Second piece of evidence. This article and tons like it would show both negative and positive consequences of going no contact with a family member. In Bernstein's paragraph on this, she highlights significantly higher rates of chronic unhappiness and depression over time. But a more accurate description would be that people estranged from family relationships experience both grief and positive effects. In fact, the grief does seem to get better over time, although it may never fully go away because that's just the nature of grief. Bernstein completely disregards the increase in positive effects, framing this as if estrangement is detrimental, rather than what it really is, a mix of both grief and empowerment. Even Pilmer's own book, where he talks about his study that he for some reason decided not to publish academically, but rather to write a book on, even his research references both. So I don't know why she's only honing in on the negatives, because there is a whole host of positives that have been documented in the literature as well. Increased meaning making, empowerment, finding different forms of community, greater emotional freedom, the list goes on. And particularly because it's such a mixed bag, most ethical professionals would never tell people to go one way or another. It's this article that's trying to frame estrangement as something negative, but therapists don't often have such a black and white view of estrangement. And given the kind of odd anti-estrangement sentiment that I felt running through this article, I was curious to check the source and its biases. Now, as far as I can tell, the journalist who wrote this piece, Elizabeth Bernstein, writes about a number of interesting topics, many of which involve mental health and relationships. I don't have a real issue with her coverage of other topics, but I did notice she chronically frames estrangement as a problem rather than a neutral phenomenon to be addressed. To my surprise, she identifies as a liberal. The reason I find this surprising is that it's becoming a very conservative talking point for some reason to frame estrangement as an attack on the traditional family, like this article was covered by Fox News, likely because making people feel like they can't leave abusive family members is often what keeps people in line with tradition. But while the author of this article, Bernstein, doesn't appear to be a conservative, I did learn that the Wall Street Journal, where she published this, is owned by Rupert Murdoch, a right-wing media mogul who financially supports organizations like Fox News and the New York Post, so it makes a bit more sense now that I know Bernstein's views on this topic align with the Wall Street Journal's very high-up political agenda. But I gotta say, framing estrangement as a political issue, as a leftist anti-family issue that conservatives must fight, is absolutely ridiculous to me. At this point, I'm kind of wondering, is there nothing that Americans won't politicize? They politicize vaccines, renewable energy, face masks, raw milk. It's getting a bit ridiculous. This is not and should not be a political issue. There are conservative people too who are estranged from their family members. There are plenty of liberal people who have tight-knit, wonderful relationships with their family members. Estrangement is a matter of communication, power dynamics, clashes in values. Those are things that can happen no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. So I find it really distasteful when people try to turn this into fear-mongering, that therapists are out to destroy the nuclear family, this is a political threat. Just because somebody supports stepping away from abusers doesn't mean they're necessarily a leftist. And likewise, I don't think it makes someone conservative to say, hey, relationships are important. If you have minor differences with someone, you should try to work on it first, and estrangement should hopefully be the last resort. If anyone is trying to convince you that estrangement is always bad or is always the route to take, they are not someone with the nuance required to be advising you on this issue. But at the end of the day, I think my biggest issue with this article is the dangerousness of making people feel like therapists are out to get them. I'm not even a therapist anymore, but I really take umbrage with journalists trying to fearmonger against the literal people who trained for years to provide evidence-based treatment to the psychologically vulnerable. If you're considering going to therapy and you're afraid they're going to try to tell you what to do, to isolate you from your closest supports, please let me assure you this is a very small risk. It is very rare that this happens. And if it does happen, if you've come across one of those rare unethical therapists, you can absolutely end the therapeutic relationship, or at least tell them you don't appreciate what they're doing. Tell them it's not helpful. But please don't think that therapists are out to get you, that they're out to destroy families. Therapists are well aware of the importance of relationships, and they are always trying to foster stronger relationships in their clients. This is not a conspiracy, you guys. Therapists have your best interests at heart. Even though they get paid, as all professionals do, they get paid for a service, that doesn't mean they're trying to isolate you from your family. Let me know what you thought about this article, and also don't forget The Splintered Parts is publishing literally next Friday. I'm so incredibly excited. If you're looking for a dark academia psychological thriller to read this August, link to learn more is below. Thank you so much for watching.